Great. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, Coco, for the very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be back here and kind of strange to be standing in what I think was Brown and Brew. And it looks amazing, and seeing the new engineering building back behind Anderson is great too. So I am at the Volpe Center now, and just before I dive into my talk, Dr. Gomez did ask if I could just tell you a little bit about how I came to Volpe, a little bit about my background. So I was a chemical engineer. I went to Queen's University up in Canada for that, and it was a very petroleum engineering heavy program. A lot of my fellow students went to work in the oil industry, but when I was there in my last year, I took a bioremediation environmental course and got just really, really interested in clean water, clean soil, and kind of switched gears away from the really heavy chemical engineering and decided to apply to graduate schools. And went and kind of met a number of people in the Boston area, all over the US, in Toronto and Calgary, and decided on Tufts. So here my advisor was Dr. Kurt Pennell, and I worked pretty closely with Linda Abriola as well. And I finished up in 2015. So it's been a couple of years since I've been back. So it's nice coming back here. I honestly kind of miss academia and the classroom setting, so I'm a little jealous of where you're sitting. But after I finished my PhD, which looked at water pollution, fate and transport, and groundwater, I did a little bit of public health work on ceramic water filters. I honestly just needed a little bit of a break from the lab, so I decided to go look at public sector jobs. At the time when I finished in 2015, things were kind of interesting in the environmental sector already. Obama was still in the White House, but I really had my heart set on the EPA, but the EPA was still kind of on a downward trend, sadly, and is still a little bit in that state. So I arrived at USDOT, which surprisingly does a lot of environmental work on kind of impacts of transportation infrastructure development on air quality, water quality. So I'll give a little bit more of an overview of Volpe. Right. So yeah, I'll give a quick overview of Volpe and then dive into what we mean by upstream emissions. I'll talk a little bit about the Clean Air Act and rulemaking in the federal government. And then I'll go into detail about EPA's Upstream Tool, which Volpe has been helping them develop over the last 4 or 5 years. So Volpe, our slogan is advancing transportation innovation for the public good. And we're located in Kendall Square in Cambridge, and we're a research technology innovation center for all of the modes of DOT. So we really work across highway, rail, aviation. We think about pipelines as modes. We do some kind of, I guess, out there modes like the Hyperloop, commercial space. We're getting involved in some new interesting things. So Volpe was founded back in 1970. There used to be a NASA Electronics Center in its place, and it was replaced by a DOT building then. And then in the 90s, it was renamed for the governor of Cambridge and one of the first secretaries of transportation, John A. Volpe. So again, we're a multimodal, multidisciplinary center. We have a lot of engineers, scientists, data scientists, people who focus kind of exclusively on safety. They look at highway crash rates, rail car incidents, aviation issues. We have people right now working with Boeing on the issues that they've had with their planes recently. We get involved in all sorts of innovative transportation issues. We're doing a lot of connected vehicle, automated vehicle work right now. And then kind of our bread and butter is infrastructure, repairing it, keeping it standing. So how do we make pavement last longer, bridges stay up longer? And then kind of where I fit into here is the environmental aspect. As we think about repairing, advancing, innovating, there are still impacts on the environment, and how do we mitigate those but still make sure that we advance and get things built. So we are an internal consultant to USDOT, so I bill every hour of my time like I would in the consulting world to either the Federal Highway Administration or Federal Aviation Administration. And we also do about 10 or 15% of our work with other agencies, whether it's federal agencies like the EPA or Department of Defense. We do a little bit of work with academia. We're trying to build up those collaborations more. And we also work with state DOTs. We do a substantial amount of work with MassDOT here actually on climate change, resiliency, how do you protect your roads against floods and rising sea levels. And then we do some international work with the Millennium Development Goals, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, World Bank, and a little bit of nonprofit work as well. So I won't dive too much into our organizational structure, but we have 4 technical centers, and this kind of gives you an idea of the breadth and depth of Volpe. And I'm in the Policy Planning and Environment Center. My home base is the Environmental Measurement and Modeling Division, but I also do a lot of work with environmental science and engineering. So energy and the environment is my main focus area again. So we're looking at how transportation and the energy that's used to drive different transportation systems impacts the natural environment and the human environment. So we look at kind of impacts on ecosystems, but we also do a lot of work on socioeconomic, safety, health benefits as well. My main area is this last bullet point, looking at noise, air quality, and water quality. My heart is still very much in the water quality area. Volpe right now doesn't do a ton of business in that area, but I'm trying to get more and more in terms of stormwater runoff off of roads is an important consideration. But for right now, my division focuses mostly on noise emissions and air quality associated primarily with highway, so heavy-duty vehicle traffic and aviation. And if you think about our air quality, heavy-duty vehicles and motor vehicle traffic in general are the main contributor to our air quality issues. It's not necessarily power plants or other sources, it's what's coming out of the tailpipes. So the project that I'll tell you more about with EPA focuses on these upstream emissions. So these are any emissions that occur before the end use at the pump. So we think of both conventional fuels and biofuels. So if you think all the way from the well, from where the crude is extracted to when it's transported to a refinery, and then it's stored, blended, and then the finished fuel is transported to some sort of end use. We look at emissions along every single part of that supply chain. On the biofuel side, we start from when the crops are grown. I'm trying to get us to incorporate the energy emissions from water that's applied to the crops, but that's actually one missing link from this right now. But yeah, we think about what goes into growing corn and soybeans, transporting those crops to a biorefinery. And then you'll see the two crude and bio sides converge. When we think of stock fuels, we think of gasoline, diesel, or ethanol or biodiesel. But most of the fuel that's used by consumers is some sort of blend. So most fuel in the US is an E10 or E15, meaning it has about 10% of ethanol that comes from growing that corn to produce the biofuel. So we transport the stock fuels to a blending station, and then the finished fuel is at E10 or E15. So I'll take a little bit of a step back. I won't try to hit you over the head too much with regulations, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the Clean Air Act, which is really the driver for the type of work that EPA and Volpe are doing with this. So it was established back in 1970, and there were big rounds of amendments in 1977 and 1990. And it was really prompted by really serious smog concerns, visibility issues, high asthma rates in cities and industrial areas. So this act set standards for 6 criteria air pollutants, so particulate matter, ozone, lead, carbon monoxide, I'm probably forgetting one, sulfur dioxide. And it also has specific provisions to address a few other issues like acid rain, regional haze, and then hazardous air pollutants, which we call HAPs. So those are air toxics like benzene, formaldehyde, that really have those direct links to cancer and health effects, more specific than the CAPs, which are going to be your general kind of cardiovascular issues, heart attacks, asthma. So EPA has been tracking those quite closely. And the Act also has flexibility to address emerging issues like greenhouse gases, although I'll try not to be too pessimistic, but with this administration, we have to be really creative and not use the term greenhouse gases or climate change, but we are still trying to do some work to advance the science there. So EPA keeps track of emissions on a nationwide level of the CAPs and the HAPs using their National Emissions Inventory, or NEI. And this gives estimates of pollution across different geographical areas. And it's used to really target regulatory actions and rulemakings. So the EPA will track how pollution is changing. They usually release the NEI every 4 years or so. The last one was released back in 2014, so we're starting to get a little bit overdue for an update. But it contains both point and non-point sources. So that's a common distinction both with air quality and water pollution. When you think of point sources, it's a very specific factory or emitter, and you know exactly where your pollution source is. With non-point, it's more general. It could be a forest fire, a large industrial area as a whole, and long-range transport of those air pollutants can happen, and you can have kind of contamination very far away from the source of both your air and deposition onto the ground and into the water table as well. And these inventories are essential inputs to other air quality models that are used to estimate air quality at a county level or city level. So in terms of pollution levels, the Clean Air Act has really been a huge success, and hopefully it stays that way and stays in place. But particulate matter and ground level ozone are substantially lower, except in a couple of pockets of the country, and they're meeting standards set for health and environment. Lead is also meeting standards, and that's primarily because we removed lead from gasoline, so it's not coming out of our motor vehicle tailpipes anymore. Same with carbon monoxide. Due to vehicle emission standards, we're seeing much lower levels of that. However, there are more concerns cropping up when it comes to particulate matter, particularly the ultrafine fractions. So I know there's some work being done here at Tufts. Dr. Durant does some work on ultrafines, and these are tiny, tiny particles, so sub 2.5 microns that can get really deep into your lungs and cause kind of unique health impacts. And they're coming out of power plants and cars, and we're still kind of trying to understand how they move in the environment and what health impacts they cause. We are also still having some issues with sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, as well as issues from the air toxics. But overall, I think the Clean Air Act has been a success, but what the Upstream Tool and EPA's kind of most recent regulatory work has focused on are where those concerns still exist, with the fines, with sulfur and nitrogen oxides causing issues with regional haze, and then air toxics still seeing pretty high cancer levels and other health impacts from those. So in terms of rulemakings, there have been some recent ones, all going back pretty much to under Obama. There were revisions to the criteria air pollutant standards as well as the air toxics. and mercury. There's also been new standards pushed through to lower gasoline or sulfur content in gasoline even further. And EPA regularly reviews the entire country and kind of the state of air quality and designates these non-attainment and maintenance areas. So for these areas, the counties or the states have to conform to air quality requirements and show EPA that they're mitigating and improving, and they get kind of different kind of regulatory actions slapped on them for not conforming. But this is all to say that the rulemakings are the real driver behind this upstream tool, because the upstream component of fuel production and transport can be a really large portion of the impacts to pushing new rulemakings through. So there's a recent heavy-duty vehicle greenhouse gas rulemaking, and that upstream portion was over a third of emissions reductions that were being suggested by the rule. So the EPA uses these types of analyses and these types of tools to tell their management, tell Congress why we should have more regulation or why we should lower standards and how it will really help improve environmental and human health. So the Upstream tool sits within EPA's existing emissions modeling framework, or EMF. And the EMF contains kind of all of EPA's air quality data, inventories. They use it as just a central repository. So we designed the Upstream tool to be very compatible with it and to use the same data sources that were coming internally from EPA and externally to produce different types of upstream inventories at different geographical scales. So the Upstream tool is all coded. I'm definitely not a developer or coder, but I've learned to use a lot of Microsoft SQL or SQL as part of this project. And I know, Volpe is always looking for people who have those skills or at least passionate about learning. And what we're trying to do with the tool is really link changes in emissions to changes in fuel type at some sort of future control scenario or future year. So if the EPA does propose to drop sulfur content even more, or they propose that instead of just having 10 or 15% ethanol in our gasoline, we should have something more like 30, we really are trying to link those regulatory changes to changes in emissions. And we can think of emissions, again, across that entire chain. So we can think of agricultural production and transport of the crops, how crude is extracted and transported, refinery emissions. We're doing some new work with cellulosic refineries, so using switchgrass and other crops that aren't really used for human consumption, and using those for biofuels. We also think about emissions from the electricity that's used to drive fuel through pipelines or power the refineries, and emissions from transporting and storage of the finished fuel blends. So this is a sort of messy schematic of our Upstream tool. We kind of just finalized the beta version of this. So I think the next time we do this, we'll maybe have something a little bit prettier, but this gives you an idea of all the different modules that are included in the tool. So each module focuses on one part of that transport, storage, supply chain there. So we have all the crude production, feedstock production, transport by different modes. So we're tracking pipeline, rail, marine, and truck right now for transporting both the crops, the crude, and the finished fuels. When we think about fuel transport, fuel use, we think about it in terms of PAD districts. And this is really I think, the only division of the country in this way is specifically for petroleum and crude purposes, and it it really speaks to where the major refineries are and major production sources are. So PADs are Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts, and these were created back in World War II when there were fuel shortages and fuel rations, to think of a way of how much fuel each part of the country should get. But these really help us now, even though we're not kind of in those war rationing times, to think about data analysis and how crude moves throughout the country. And we think a lot about multimodal transport. So this has been a big part of the project, is to gather data on capacity of each of these modes to carry fuel, grain, blend stocks, and finished fuels. And we think about transport distances within the pads, between pads, and from refineries to the blending terminals, from the field to refineries, from the blending terminal to the pump. So initially when we started this project, before we did any coding, we were just collecting raw data on how much grain could one truck carry, what were the typical distances that grain was going by rail, how far was it from refineries on the Texas coast to bring that finished fuel to California, for instance. So here's just one example of crude movements by rail. And you can see that most of the crude is originating in Pad 2. So you have the big kind of crude producers in Dakotas and coming down from Canada. And then you have most of the transport going to Pad 1, where there are big refineries, as well as to the Gulf Coast. Here's an example of the crude transport by rail module. We generally, with upstream emissions, think backwards. So if I can go back to here, where I have this retail fuel demand, we typically tend to backtrack and we think of how much gasoline, blended gasoline, so E10 or E15, are consumers in the US using each year. And if we know they're using that much, what does that mean in terms of how much crop, how much corn we need to produce ethanol that goes into that blend, and how much crude we need to extract. So we tend to work backwards. So we know some sort of crude demand coming into what's going to be needed to transport crude by rail from Freight Analysis Framework, which is a big data repository. Part of it's managed by the BTS, Bureau for Transportation Statistics, by DOE, but it's a big data gathering effort that we get a lot of this intra-pad movement data from. We think of how far the crude needs to move and how much fuel the rail cars, the locomotives themselves, are using to transport the fuel. And then in the end, we come up with emissions on a pad level basis for both domestic movements and foreign movements. So we have some rail going between US and Canada and US and Mexico. In terms of what we end up getting out of the EMF, we get pad level emissions inventories for the criteria air pollutants, the hazardous air pollutants, greenhouse gases, which we tend to measure in terms of CO2e or carbon dioxide equivalents. And we know in Pad 1, for example, what each of these pollutants looks like in terms of emissions from rail transport of the crude. We also have a crude transport by pipeline module. So pipeline is a little bit trickier to analyze. You don't really have any sort of tailpipe emissions combustion where you have a known emissions rate, but we do know how much emissions we get from electricity needed to power the pipelines and pump the fuel across the country. So here's an image here of just the major pipeline networks, kind of concentrated again in Pad 2 and then the Gulf Coast. And we end up calculating state-level electricity inventories at both the domestic level and then for different foreign regions as well. So this is maybe my most favorite module, is agricultural production and transport. I find it, I guess, kind of fascinating because there's a sort of competition between all of the corn that we grow for human consumption, for livestock, so what we kind of feed to drive the rest of the livestock agricultural sector, and then what is grown for corn ethanol. And you may have heard there's been a lot of studies done on life cycle analysis of corn grown for ethanol, and it's maybe not the most sustainable way to do it in the US. Brazil grows sugarcane to produce their ethanol, and that's been shown to be a lot more kind of economically viable, environmentally friendly, but we are kind of bound by regulations and farm bills in Congress right now to use corn ethanol in our gasoline blends. But so for this module, we were thinking of feedstock demand, so how much raw agricultural material is needed for a biorefinery to meet a final retail demand of that finished gasoline product. So we're using USDA, Department of Agriculture, data on a county level to determine how much corn is grown on a per county basis. We're looking at transport distances between fields and the refineries. And to come up with emissions, we look at some sort of feedstock demand for a refinery and multiply that by an emissions factor to get those emissions. So we did this in 3 phases. The first was just to assume that the feedstock to supply all the biorefineries is provided from counties within a really defined radius. However, that feedstock production might not meet the refinery demand, but we ignored that just to get a kind of first draft done in phase 1. In phase 2, we looked at kind of expanding this radius here to meet feedstock demand entirely, and made sure we weren't double counting between refineries as we expanded that radius. And phase 3 looked more closely at transport modes available. So we started this by only looking at trucks transporting feedstock, but there are a lot of rail lines as well that are used in certain parts of the country for transporting feedstock to the biorefineries. So this is where the geospatial analysis part came into play. So this was kind of an ArcMap, SQL, Excel, everything mashed together exercise to get this to work in the end. But we mapped out facility locations using EPA data on where every single biorefinery was located in the country. We started with a 50-mile facility buffer, so that's from the field to the refinery distance. We looked at the rail networks and feedstock demand for each of those facilities, as we knew their production volumes and their facility statistics. So for this, we used USDA, we used some census data, and then we used mandatory reporting data that facilities are required to give the EPA every few years. So just an example here of where facilities are located in the country. So this is showing corn, ethanol, and biodiesel refineries. And you can see they are very concentrated in the Midwest, where most of the crops are grown, but there are a few in other pockets of the country where there isn't a lot of agricultural production. Here are the major corn-producing counties with the facilities overlaid. So you can see in California, in Pacific Northwest, there are a couple of facilities in counties without any corn production. So this proved, I guess, a little bit challenging for our algorithm, where we have a radius that's trying to go out and out and out, and if it can never really hit a corn-producing county, that was something that we had to address. Here are the biodiesel facilities, for which there are quite a lot fewer. We don't have a lot of vehicles, processes right now running purely off of biodiesel, but it's starting to come more into play. Here are, again, the ethanol facilities and corn production by county with 50-mile buffers, buffer circles. So again, you can see almost all of facility demand is being met by corn production, but there are a few outliers. Just a close-up here where we have some overlapping 50-mile zones around facilities. So in phase 2 of this module development, we did allow facilities to obtain feedstock from different sources in different counties. This is a map here of major rail lines, which are also used to move both the fuel and the crops. And this does kind of help explain why we have some major outliers in California. They sit on big rail lines. So we did flag a couple of facilities that were entirely outside of corn-producing counties in California and in the Northwest, but they were situated on major rail lines, so we were able to mostly explain that away and build this into our algorithm. And this map here shows production versus demand. So facility demand for the raw material versus what the fields are producing in terms of yields. This is 2014 data. Same thing for biodiesel and soybeans. So is facility demand being met by feedstock producing counties is kind of a major question that we needed to answer and make work for this module to run properly. And we did find that facility demand in some cases wasn't being met by counties that the facilities were in or adjacent to. And this is something we're still kind of trying to work out the kinks, because are the facilities necessarily getting their corn or their soybeans from the county within 50 miles, or is it being transported longer distances across the country? And that's just something we don't quite have data on yet. So we've made maybe an assumption that needs to be refined, but that facilities are completely getting all of their feedstock within 50 miles. We think there's some underreporting, though, happening with the USDA data, that we're missing some of the smaller facilities. The smaller ones aren't necessarily required to report. So this is something for, I guess, beta ×2 version before release that we're working on. So just to wrap up our Upstream tool, we think it is really going to be a benefit in rulemakings when we're thinking about those upstream emissions, all sorts of different modes and fuel types. It's quite a transparent model. It'll be publicly available since it's an EPA model. All of the source code will be available as well. We are trying to really clearly document as we go along the way, make sure that everything is very open, repeatable. So we have a lot of metadata built in to all of the data sets and the modules. And again, it'll be packaged up for sharing, so it's a pretty easy tool to use, especially for someone who has quite limited computer developing skills. I find it mostly user-friendly. And ultimately, once we do finalize the tool, it's going to be used in 2 upcoming rulemakings. One is for heavy-duty nitrogen oxides, so that's looking at tailpipe emissions of NOx coming out of big trucks. And then regional haze. So the last regional haze rulemaking, I think, was back in 2016, but that is based on some kind of outdated data, but we've been finding more and more that there are serious haze issues in national parks and in urban centers where you have a lot of reduced visibility, and then also health issues associated with that. So that's kind of the end of my technical talk, but I did want to put a plug in for our internships at Volpe. Applications are due next week. We're looking for all sorts of different positions, different skill types. You can either apply on the Volpe website or on USA Jobs is another option, and those are either starting in January or in the spring, and I can send you the link after as well. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Hi, thank you so much. This was useful to know. I'm a grad student here at the Fletcher School, focusing my research actually on electric buses and the emissions impact, the policy, the technology involved. My question to you is Volpe doing work on, you spoke about sort of future projections and future scenarios in a 5-10-year timeline with the projected sort of rise of electric vehicles, heavy duty or passenger vehicles. What would be the impact to the upstream emissions, and would you then start tracking, because obviously electric vehicles are not 100% clean, you'd have to go to the grid emissions, just some of the interesting work on that in that space.
Sure, yeah, no, thank you for the question. I do wish we were looking at upstream emissions of electric vehicles. It's unfortunately just not a part of this project, but I know there are grid implications. There's brake and tire wear, so you have a lot of kind of metals that can get into your waterways that way. For another project I'm involved with Federal Highway, we are doing more electric vehicle work and tracking emissions from that go into production of the battery, the entire life cycle, looking at brake and tire wear. But I do see it as something that we need to think more and more about going into the future.
Is that accessible? Is that on the website, or is that mostly
No, there's a program at Federal Highway Administration called CMAQ, CMAQ, and they provide funding to states who are implementing different programs like electrifying their bus fleets, electric tractors if they're in an agricultural area, and we have been kind of looking at emissions from those changes.
Hi. You talked a little bit about the relative sustainability of producing biofuels from corn and soybeans. So you were talking a little bit about how they might potentially be not sustainable, and I was just wondering if you knew how sustainable they were relative to fossil fuels, and maybe if there's a better option, like other kinds of renewable energy, like wind and solar.
Sure, yeah. I know just from other work on a life cycle basis, I still think that the renewable fuel option, even if it's from corn-based ethanol, is more sustainable than a crude-based fossil fuel. But I think it's maybe also how you think about sustainability. So a lot of people, I guess, don't think about upstream emissions necessarily. They don't think of all of the water that goes into producing electricity that could go into some sort of electric fleet. I think we're always trending in the right way if we talk about getting off of dependence from fossil fuels and into more renewables, but it's still, I think, something that needs some further analysis. I think the other thing is that wind and solar are great options, but I think with our current situation, they still can't provide that baseload power that fossil fuels are providing in most parts of the country. So I think it's going to take a little bit longer for the full switch to happen like it has in places like Germany and other places in Europe.
Testing. Hey, Anjuliee, that was a great talk. I was just, being an EWRE, double jumbo, you probably had to take systems. And I couldn't help but thinking, looking at this modeling framework, that in so many of like the submodules, like there could be potentials for an optimization, like turning this into an optimization type of model. Do you think that would be something that the DOT would consider
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about that at all. It's very much ringing Rich Vogel systems bells, though. Yeah, I'd kind of want to chat more, think more about that, but we haven't, I guess, gotten to that kind of fine-tuning optimization yet, but I do feel like the model will meet that at some point. Yeah.
Hi. I work in the Office of Sustainability here, so I do the greenhouse gas inventory for the university. A quick question, kind of to follow up from over there. Are you familiar with renewable natural gas from anaerobic digestion?
I am.
And I'm curious if you would use that in these models as well. Yeah, so I think that would be like an alternative to corn and soy-produced ethanol. And the other question is land use change. Did you mention land use change? I couldn't remember.
We didn't.
So.
No, it's
Okay.
definitely a consideration. Yeah, we did not do a lot of land use modeling as part of this. So if you have, impacts and you're deforesting, you have emissions impacts associated with that. But yeah, it's something I think we should have touched on the anaerobic gas kind of generation from farm waste or the fats, oil, solids. I actually don't know if those can be, I guess, used by vehicles to run up. They can't. Okay, I don't know too much
Compressed
about it.
CNG vehicles.
Okay.
The World Resources Institute has a good paper on it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I feel like that's something that we could include as a fuel type, a fuel option in this. I did a little bit of work when I was an undergrad on anaerobic digesters at farms in Ontario, but they were using primarily the gas to drive these little engines and turbines just to heat their greenhouse gases in facilities, but I can definitely see it being used larger scale.
While I get there, can you talk about the tensions of working with an administration where you cannot mention the words climate change?
Oh, I've been trying not to get too political. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings when I go to work every day, but it's okay. I think the Department of Transportation as a whole has been fairly insulated from some of the actions of this administration. I guess we haven't seen, I guess, the same impacts on just our workforce numbers and personnel like the EPA has, or some of the land management agencies, which they want to do drilling on, have. But yeah, I think we have to be very, very cautious with our written materials. Our kind of public affairs engine right now is just in complete overdrive, and there's a lot of sensitivity even to using the word environment. To be honest, we talk about it a lot more with tools like this in terms of streamlining, again, not environmental, but streamlining or expediting, accelerating project delivery. So our kind of reasoning behind this tool is that it will make the rulemaking process more efficient. It'll alleviate the burden from the states, the counties, those kind of local transportation agencies from having to do a lot of in-depth air quality analysis, because we're doing some of it up front, so they'll be able to put kind of more of their efforts into building projects and fixing infrastructure. So I think we're really trying to reframe the environmental work, unfortunately. Yeah.
So I have a two-part question. One is, it seems like when you start modeling this, you can quickly get down a rabbit hole of what to include, what not to include, and I would like to hear you talk about the process of how you've sort of established what upstream variables to cover and not to cover. And then my second question is that I've read in various places that competition for rail time is really intense in the Midwest. So when coal was doing really well, they were dominating the rail use, and rail use is so much more efficient than truck use. Now with coal dying, how is that changing the kinds of calculations that you're doing, thinking about moving biofuels. Is that part of the calculation as coal goes down, rail goes up, therefore it's becoming more efficient?
Right, yeah, thank you. I guess on the first one, how do we consider what variables to include, not to include? That really comes from EPA's upper management in this administration. I think we put together the general framework of all points of the supply chain that we have to hit on, but we've certainly had a lot more focus on the agricultural side of things, making sure to capture kind of all parts of the country, all producers. We've had a lot of focus on pipelines as well, and making sure we're tracking those properly. We do have, I guess, a very, very lengthy list of assumptions and limitations. So I think we acknowledge that this is not I guess, complete model entirely at this point. I think we're presenting as our best estimate, and we tend to think of things in terms of deltas rather than absolutes too. So I think that can help with the case as well. In terms of the rail network, for purposes of this modeling, we look at, I guess, yearly reports from the freight analysis framework, from other data sources of what the primary commodities are that are being transported by rail, and we do expect that breakdown to change. I know railroads are in kind of tough shape right now in some parts of the country, so whether that means switching more of our feedstock fuel transport to fuels, I think is interesting. Whether that would be more environmentally friendly, lead to fewer emissions, I'm not sure. The locomotive engines are very, very dirty. Marine engines, the diesel engines, are essentially just big locomotive engines. They put out a ton of particulate matter and NOx. So in areas with big rail yards, big ports, you do have some really serious air pollution concerns, and the conversion to renewables or electric locomotives has been a lot slower than it has for other modes. I'd say just when you go to rail yards, they have little shunter switcher locomotives moving cars around that are from the 1930s still, 1950s, and there's no real driver for them to upgrade. So I think there needs to be some sort of regulatory action to really encourage more rail and cleaner rail.
So as you showed us with the maps, obviously, like the sources of our power are very centralized in the U.S., which leads to a lot of emissions, like you said, just in the transit process. But do you know if Volpe in general has any projects going on looking at a more like decentralized power grid with like more place-based sources of energy?
Yeah, we tend to do most of our work at a national scale. But I think that more kind of localized power could be a good solution to some of the problems. But yeah, a lot of our focus is on like alternatives fuel corridors, trying to make that CNG, the electric power available across the entire country, sort of thing, yeah, right now.
No final questions? Okay, well, let's thank her one more time.